German troops have Moscow in their gun sights. They are less than 20 miles from the center of the city.
We believe that the mass of the Russian army had already been destroyed, and that the advance on Moscow was basically a matter of marching speed and not of enemy resistance. Since there was no more enemy between us and Moscow, we were sure the war was over.
Stalin has the city fortified and parts of the government evacuated. He has a secret subterranean bunker built in the countryside. An emergency seat of government in case Hitler's troops seize control of Moscow. A train is kept waiting at the station for Stalin's escape. But Stalin stays. Now, the man who'd ordered the ransacking of churches and sent thousands of priests to the Gulag uses the power of faith for his own purposes. The churches are opened again.
Божиею помощью наша доблестная русская армия изгонит фашистскую нечисть из пределов нашей Родины.
With the future of the country at stake, Stalin sends fresh troops to the front. They march from Red Square directly into battle. Stalin will also listen to the advice of General Zhukov. Troops from the Asian front are sent to reinforce his lines, troops that are trained in winter warfare. Stalin now gets the break he needs. The full force of Russian winter stops the Germans in their tracks. The tide of the battle for Moscow has turned. The battle for Moscow has turned. Russian lines hold, and their troops now move on the offensive. Hitler will soon suffer his first major defeat. His forces are overextended, and his troops weakened by the bitter cold of winter. Within months, the Germans are forced to retreat. Moscow is saved. The Allies are now more confident in Stalin's leadership and Russian prospects. The United States and Britain ship enormous amounts of supplies, supplies that will make a decisive difference. But Stalin wants more from the Allies. He desperately wants a second front that will require Hitler to split his forces and fight on both his eastern and western borders. But the Allies are reluctant.
For Stalin, victims didn't count. His own people didn't count. They were just statistics. Neither the Americans or the English want to lose more people than they had to. That's partly why they lingered with the second front.
In the north, Leningrad has been surrounded by the Germans for months. Stalin could have evacuated the city, but he decides the people should stand and fight. He demands that every citizen take up arms, every soldier defend his family. Valor at any price. The siege would last 900 days. Hitler plans to starve Leningrad.
For a while there was shooting, and then there was silence. Why? The German shouted something inconceivable, which I hesitate to repeat here. They called, "You are going to die one way or another. The city is going to die."
Leningrad becomes a symbol for the suffering of the civilian population. Families are torn apart. Children must bury children.
They said my little brother, Yurik, had died, and shouted, "Get the sled from home and pick him up." I didn't know how to tell my mother. A truck came loaded with dead bodies just like they used to transport lumber. They were not sewn into a cloth, but lay there the way they had been picked up from the street. They were dumped into a pit. For a long time I stood there and watched. One of the volunteer helpers approached me and asked, "Why are you standing here, girl?" "I am waiting," I replied, "for the pit to fill up so we can put the boy on top. Otherwise he will be crushed."
Over 1 million people die in Leningrad from cold and starvation. But the hatred that Hitler stirs up will strengthen Stalin.
We went to war for the fatherland and for Stalin. You may deny that today, or mention only the country, but the country was linked inseparably with the word Stalin.
In the south, the German army is heading towards Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Stalin will defend the city that bears his name at all costs. Hitler desperately wants to conquer it. It is a battle of will and egos. But Stalin will put his ego aside and let his generals fight the war.
In fact, the generals were now in control. He only confirmed their decisions. Only on occasion, when he meddled with their business, things would turn bad.
This new strategy brings victory for the Russians. Stalingrad marks the turning point of the war. German Field Marshal Paulus is taken prisoner. The Germans offer Stalin's son Yakov as a trade.
When Stalin heard the proposal to save Yakov from captivity and let Paulus go in return, he thought about it for a while and then decided he would not swap a general for one of our junior officers.
Stalin rejects the exchange. He lets his son die in a German concentration camp.
I am often asked whether I hate Stalin for not bartering my father for Field Marshal Paulus. Well, I certainly would have had a better life if my father had been alive. But I usually reply that Stalin had no choice. Stalin was, after all, the man of steel.
And in a barbaric display, Stalin would parade German prisoners through the streets of Moscow.
I went to the Red Square with a friend of mine whose husband was killed in the war at the front. And we stood and saw these animals as we thought. And we saw wretched human beings. They weren't even red-haired as we thought, you know, Fritzes. They were normal, wretched people going on and on and on. And I felt terrible, but I didn't want to say that to my friend because her husband was killed. And she turned to me and said, "I feel no hatred."
June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Normandy invasion. The Allies' second front is finally open. The days of Hitler's Reich are numbered, and the Allies will plan the post-war era. Yalta in the Crimea. At a conference hosted by Stalin, the Allies meet. Stalin demands control of conquered German territories in the east. The Western powers are tired of war. They have achieved their objectives, and so they concede.
At Yalta, Stalin had a much more determined, not necessarily clear, but determined view of how the world was going to change after the war. And Stalin, being that immovable object, what were they going to do? Invade him? He knew they wouldn't do that. And he knew he had all the cards. And the weakness of the West for him was always evident in its desire to compromise and its desire to be a good guy, to have friends. Stalin didn't need friends. Stalin needed enemies.
April 1945, the March on Berlin. Stalin wants to reach the capital and make it into the history books as the man who conquered Hitler.
It was important for him to reach Berlin before General Eisenhower, especially since there was no resistance in the approach from the Western Front.
He let tens of thousands die in senseless attacks just to take Berlin in time. Hundreds of thousands of lives were sacrificed, although the war was really already won.
And in a final act of vengeance, Stalin orders thousands of German civilians killed when they attempt to flee.
Of course it was drummed into our heads by our propaganda. Whenever you meet a German, kill him.
Berlin, May 1945. Stalin reaches his goal. During a tour of the city, high-ranking Soviets visit Hitler's bunker and discover his body. Stalin insists on secrecy.
Under no circumstances was Hitler's death to be publicized. That was Stalin's explicit order. For this reason, no photographers, no press, no film crews were present when the body was discovered. Absolutely nobody. It was to remain top secret.
Hitler's Reich has fallen. For Russia, the human cost of victory is staggering. It is the highest casualty figure for any country in the history of war. 27 million men, women, and children are dead. 1945. Russia is now a superpower. Stalin celebrates his European victory with a parade in Moscow. He now calls himself Generalissimus.
When the war was finally over, when it had ended with victory, Stalin, of course, became a god, a hero. That was an unforgettable time.
Stalin sees himself as the invincible general and conqueror of Hitler.
He was hailed as the greatest strategist of all times and all peoples. Of course, he was nothing of the kind.
In fact, Stalin was inept as a military strategist.
He didn't understand strategy. He knew nothing about advanced military maneuvering, and he just could never win a battle if his life depended on it.
The people did not win the war thanks to Stalin, but in spite of Stalin.
He wanted to liquidate anybody who knew about his miserable failures in the war during 41 and 42.
But in Stalin's fictionalized film version, The Fall of Berlin, he is the hero.
He wanted history to remember him as the great victor. Not as the frightened politician who was scared as hell of him.